The Sherman sat there in the snow like a grave marker, turret blown clean off, track shredded, hull punctured in 3 places by armor-piercing rounds that had torn through American steel like it was sheet metal. Staff Sergeant Vincent Kowalski of the 3rd Armored Division stood 50 yards back, studying that wreck through binoculars, and what he saw made absolutely no sense. The tank had been sitting in that exact position for 11 days. 11 days since the German counteroffensive had pushed through this sector of Belgium. 11 days since his own crew had retreated under orders, leaving good men and good equipment behind. But now, in January of 1945, with the bulge collapsing and American forces pushing back east, Kowalski was looking at something that defied every tactical principle he'd learned. That dead Sherman, that useless pile of metal, had become the single most important piece of terrain in a 10-mile radius, and the Germans were guarding it like it contained the crown jewels. He lowered the binoculars and looked at his gunner, Corporal Eddie Brennan, who was shaking his head slowly. 3 German machine gun positions in a triangle around the wreck, 2 Panzer IVs hull down on the ridgeline behind it, a mortar team dug in somewhere to the north, probably behind the tree line. All of that firepower, all of that attention, focused on protecting a tank that couldn't move, couldn't shoot, and by all rights should have been stripped for parts and abandoned. Kowalski had been fighting in Europe since Normandy. He'd seen plenty of things that made him question whether God had a sense of humor or just a cruel streak. But this was different. This was chess, and he was staring at a board where his opponent had sacrificed 3 bishops and a rook to protect a pawn that was already dead. The radio crackled. Battalion wanted to know why 2nd Platoon hadn't moved up to the road junction yet. Kowalski picked up the handset and told them exactly what he was seeing. The response came back 30 seconds later, and it was the kind of order that made a man's stomach drop. Bypass it. The wreck isn't worth the casualties. Push northeast to the objective. He stared at that Sherman again. Something in his gut, something that came from watching Germans fight for 8 months straight, told him that bypassing this wreck would be the worst mistake of his military career. The enemy doesn't commit that kind of firepower to sentiment. They don't waste ammunition and positioning on symbolism. If the Germans wanted that hulk protected, there was a reason, and that reason was going to bite someone in the backside real soon. Kowalski made a choice that would either get him court-martialed or decorated. He told Battalion his radio was acting up, clicked off, and started moving his platoon into assault positions. He had 4 Shermans left in his command, 16 men who trusted him not to get them killed for nothing, and he was about to send them straight into a kill box because his instincts were screaming that whatever secret that wreck was hiding, it needed to die before nightfall. The plan was simple, because complicated plans got people buried in foreign soil. 2 tanks would provide suppressing fire from the western approach, forcing the German machine gunners to keep their heads down. Kowalski's tank and 1 other would flank south, use the depression in the terrain for cover, and come at the wreck from the blind side, where the Panzer IVs couldn't depress their main guns low enough to engage. Fast, violent, overwhelming. Get in, figure out what the Germans were protecting, destroy it, and get out before they could coordinate a response. They rolled out at 1400 hours. The temperature was 9 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that the oil in the tank's transmission moved like molasses, cold enough that exposed skin would stick to metal. Kowalski stood in the commander's hatch, scanning through the vision blocks, watching for the inevitable moment when the Germans realized what was happening. It came 30 seconds into the movement. Tracers from an MG-42 machine gun streaked across the snow, kicking up plumes of white powder as they searched for range. His supporting tanks opened up immediately, 75mm high-explosive rounds slamming into the German positions, turning snow and frozen earth into geysers of debris. The noise was absolute. Inside the tank, even with the hatch open, the sound of the main gun was a physical presence that compressed your chest and made your teeth ache. Kowalski dropped into the turret, pulled the hatch shut, and gave the order to move faster. The Sherman lurched forward, track links clattering, engine roaring. Through the periscope, he could see the destroyed tank getting closer, and that was when he noticed something that made his blood turn colder than the Belgian winter. Fresh tool marks on the hull, recent welding scars near the sponson, footprints in the snow around the wreck that weren't 11 days old. They were hours old. The Germans hadn't been guarding a dead tank. They'd been working on it. Brennan saw it the same moment Kowalski did. The gunner's voice came through the intercom, tight with controlled fear. "Skipper, that thing's been modified. I can see cut marks on the lower plate. They pulled something out or put something in." Kowalski keyed the radio to warn the other tanks, but he never got the transmission out. The German mortar team that had been sitting quiet finally found their range, and the world became thunder and shrapnel. 3 rounds impacted in a bracketing pattern, close enough that the concussion made the Sherman ring like a bell. The tank to Kowalski's left took a direct hit on the engine deck, and smoke started pouring from the grills. They were committed now. No pulling back, no second guessing. Kowalski ordered his driver to push straight for the wreck, while Brennan traversed the turret looking for targets. The two Panzer IVs on the ridge were starting to reposition, trying to get an angle. In about 40 seconds, they'd have firing solutions, and a Panzer Waffen-SS 75mm gun could punch through a Sherman's front armor at this range without breaking a sweat. The distance closed. 200 yards. 150. Kowalski could see details now that made his tactical situation go from bad to catastrophic. The Germans had dug a fighting position underneath the wrecked Sherman, using the hull itself as overhead cover. They'd excavated the earth beneath it, created a bunker that was protected by 5 inches of American armor plate on top, and reinforced by steel beams they'd welded into place. It was brilliant and absolutely insane. They'd turned a destroyed tank into a fortified position that was nearly immune to artillery and completely hidden from aerial observation. But that wasn't the part that terrified him. The part that terrified him was the Tiger tank barrel he could now see poking out from underneath the Sherman's hull. They'd hidden a functional tank gun under a dead tank, dug it in, camouflaged it, and waited. Probably waiting for a column of American armor to roll past, close enough for guaranteed kills. One gun, unlimited patience, and a firing position that was invisible until you were standing on top of it. Kowalski didn't hesitate. He gave Brennan the target, a point-blank shot into the sponson of the wrecked Sherman, aiming for the welded modifications. If they could collapse that hull, bury that hidden gun position under 10 tons of steel, they'd eliminate the threat. Brennan fired. The 75mm armor-piercing round hit the Sherman's side armor and punched through, detonating somewhere inside the hull. The explosion was immediate and spectacular. Turns out the Germans had been storing ammunition in there, probably for the hidden Tiger gun. Secondary explosions started cooking off, turning the wreck into a fireworks display of burning propellant and detonating shells. The German machine gun teams broke and ran. The Panzer IVs on the ridge started reversing, pulling back before the smoke and chaos drew American artillery fire. Kowalski's tank sat there in the snow, engine idling, watching the wreck burn. The hidden gun position was gone, buried under collapsing metal and flame. Whatever ambush the Germans had been planning died with it. The tank that had taken the mortar hit limped back to friendly lines, crew shaken but alive. No American casualties, a German strongpoint eliminated. By the book, it was a successful action. But Kowalski couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just seen something that would show up again, somewhere else, in some other form. The enemy was learning, adapting, using the wreckage of battle as raw material for new horrors. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Battalion finally got through on the radio 3 hours later, demanding to know why 2nd Platoon had ignored orders and assaulted a position they'd been told to bypass. Kowalski filed his report, detailed and factual. He described the defensive positions, the modified hull, the hidden gun. He attached photographs that his crew had taken of the wreckage before they pulled back. He laid out exactly why that seemingly useless tank had been worth the risk. The response came down 2 days later. Corps intelligence confirmed that the tactic had been used in at least 4 other sectors during the bulge. Destroyed Allied vehicles, modified and weaponized, turned into static defensive positions that were nearly impossible to detect until they opened fire. The Germans called them Panzer nests, tank nests. Cheap, effective, and psychologically devastating because they turned the debris of American losses into weapons aimed back at American troops. Kowalski's action got flagged for commendation, but more importantly, it got circulated as a tactical bulletin. Every tank company and First Army received instructions on identifying and neutralizing panzer nests. Aerial reconnaissance started looking for specific patterns, tracks in the snow leading to wrecks, fresh earth near destroyed vehicles, defensive positions that seemed too focused on protecting something worthless. The welding trick, as it became known among American tankers, lost its effectiveness almost overnight once people knew what to look for. The Germans tried it 3 more times in Kowalski's sector over the next month. Each time, American crews approached the wrecks with suspicion instead of indifference, used standoff weapons instead of close assault, and denied the enemy the ambush they'd prepared for. But the psychological impact lingered. Every destroyed tank became a potential threat. Every piece of battlefield debris had to be treated as possibly hostile. The war had already trained men to trust nothing, but this added a new layer. Even your own losses could be weaponized against you. Even the graves of your friends could hide the guns that would finish the job. Kowalski kept fighting through the winter and into spring. His crew rotated twice, men shipping home with frostbite or wounds, or just enough points to justify a ticket back to the States. He stayed because somebody had to teach the new guys how to read a battlefield, how to see the things that would kill them before those things got the chance. They crossed the Rhine in March, pushed into Germany proper, started seeing things that made the tactical challenges of combat seem almost quaint by comparison. Camps, factories of death, evidence of systematic horror that redefined what men were capable of doing to other men. Kowalski stopped thinking about welding tricks and hidden guns. Those were problems with solutions. What they found in Germany was something different, something that would take generations to process. The war in Europe ended in May. Kowalski was in Czechoslovakia when the surrender came through, sitting on the hull of his Sherman, smoking a cigarette that tasted like victory and ash. Brennan was still with him somehow. The driver was new, the loader was new, the bow gunner was new. But Brennan had survived the whole nightmare, and that counted for something. They talked about the wreck sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, about the decision to assault it, about the hidden gun, about how close they'd come to rolling past it and letting some other poor crew discover the surprise the hard way. Brennan always said the same thing. You read it right, Ski. Your gut was right. Kowalski wasn't so sure. He'd been right that time, but he'd been wrong other times. He'd made calls that got men hurt, made choices that in hindsight looked stupid or reckless or both. The only difference was that the wreck had worked out. The dice had rolled his way. In another timeline, another version of events, his tank would have taken a round from that hidden Tiger gun, and some other sergeant would be filing the report about the burned-out Sherman and the crew that didn't make it. He rotated home in July of 1945, sailed back to New York on a Liberty ship packed with men who'd seen too much and said too little. The voyage took 12 days, and Kowalski spent most of it on deck, watching the ocean and trying to figure out how to explain the last 11 months to people who'd experienced the war through newsreels and ration book. He couldn't. The gap was too wide, so he did what most veterans did. He found work, found a wife, started a family, and packed the memories away in a place where they wouldn't interfere with normal life. The smell of cordite and burning diesel, the sound of armor-piercing rounds hitting steel, the specific weight of knowing that your decisions determined whether boys went home or stayed in foreign soil forever. Kowalski didn't talk about the wreck for 30 years. Didn't mention it, didn't think about it, kept it locked down with all the other things that belonged to a different version of himself. But in 1975, his grandson came home from school with the assignment about World War II, and suddenly the old man found himself telling the story about the Sherman in the snow, about the Germans who'd turned American losses into weapons, about the welding trick that had almost worked. His grandson asked the obvious question, "Were you scared?" Kowalski thought about it, really thought about it, maybe for the first time since the event itself, and his answer was honest. "I was terrified. But being scared doesn't matter if you're doing the thing anyway." That became his standard response whenever the subject came up, which was more often as he got older and the distance from the war made it easier to discuss. Young men from the local VFW post would ask him about combat, about leadership, about how you make decisions when the consequences are measured in lives. He always brought them back to the wreck, to the moment when instinct and analysis collided, when doctrine said one thing and experience whispered something else. "You trust your training until your training doesn't fit the situation," he'd tell them. "Then you trust yourself, and you live with whatever happens next." The 3rd Armored Division held reunions every few years, and Kowalski attended when he could. The group got smaller each time, faces more lined, handshakes weaker. Brennan made it to most of them, still sharp, still carrying himself like a gunner. They'd find a quiet corner, drink beer that tasted nothing like the Belgian brew they'd liberated back in '44, and talk about people who weren't there anymore. The wreck came up at the reunion in 1983. Someone had brought a collection of unit photographs, and buried in there was a picture of the destroyed Sherman, taken the day after Kowalski's platoon had neutralized it. The hull was collapsed, the hidden gun position visible now in the daylight, German bodies still in the fighting pit, evidence of how close it had been, how much damage that single position could have inflicted if it had remained hidden. An officer from Army Historical Services was at the reunion, collecting oral histories. He recorded Kowalski's account of the engagement, asked detailed questions about the German tactics, about the modifications to the hull, about the decision-making process. The story ended up in a published history of armored warfare in the European theater, a footnote about adaptive enemy tactics and the importance of battlefield awareness. Kowalski read that passage once and never looked at the book again. It was accurate, factual, properly sourced. It was also completely inadequate. The historian had captured the what and the when, but he'd missed the why it mattered. He'd documented the tactical innovation without understanding the psychological dimension, the way it felt to realize that even your losses could be used against you, the way it changed how you looked at every piece of wreckage, every burnt-out vehicle, every apparently harmless piece of battlefield debris. The fear didn't come from the gun itself. The fear came from knowing that the enemy was smart enough, desperate enough, creative enough to turn the evidence of their victories into weapons for the next fight. It came from the realization that there was no such thing as a safe rear area, no such thing as truly dead equipment, no such thing as a piece of terrain that didn't require constant vigilance. That was the real lesson of the wreck. Not the tactics, not the welding, not the hidden gun. The lesson was that war demanded absolute attention, absolute paranoia, absolute refusal to assume anything was as simple as it appeared. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Kowalski's wife passed in 1991, and he moved into a smaller place, an apartment near his daughter's house. The walls were covered with pictures, mostly family, a few from the service. There was one photograph from Belgium, winter of '44, showing 2nd Platoon standing in front of their Shermans. Kowalski was in the center, looking about 20 years older than his actual age of 23. Brennan was to his left, grinning, despite the cold. 8 other faces, some of which came home, some of which didn't. He'd stare at that photograph sometimes and wonder what the boys who didn't make it would think about the world they'd missed. 50 years of peace in Europe, prosperity, alliances with former enemies, the Cold War, Vietnam, the fall of the Berlin Wall, all of it bought with the blood of kids who'd never seen 30, who'd died in snow or mud or fire, who'd trusted their sergeants to make the right calls. The weight of that trust never really went away. Kowalski carried it until the day he died in 2004, at the age of 82. Heart failure, peaceful, surrounded by family. A good death, as deaths go. Better than the ones he'd seen in Belgium. At the funeral, Brennan stood at the casket, old and bent, but still recognizably the gunner who'd served with Kowalski through the entire European campaign. He told the story of the wreck one last time, to an audience of grandchildren and great-grandchildren who'd never known war, who'd never had to make decisions where the wrong choice meant your friends went home in bags. He told it the way Kowalski would have wanted. No embellishment, no heroics, just the facts. A destroyed tank, a suspicious defensive pattern, a sergeant who trusted his instincts over his orders, a hidden gun that would have killed dozens if it had been allowed to stay hidden. And then Brennan said the thing that mattered most. Your grandfather saved lives that day. Not just his crew, not just 2nd Platoon, every tanker who read that bulletin, who learned to recognize the signs, who approached wrecks with caution instead of indifference. He saved people who never knew his name, never met him, never had the chance to say thank you. That's the thing about good decisions in combat. The consequences ripple outward in ways you can't predict or measure. One sergeant in one tank in one small piece of Belgium, making a choice that seemed insane at the time, and the result was a tactical adaptation that spread through an entire army. Knowledge purchased with risk, shared freely, used to keep other men alive. The German tactic of weaponizing wrecks didn't survive the war. It was too resource-intensive, too dependent on surprise, too vulnerable once the secret was out. But the principle survived. Adaptive tactics, creative use of terrain, turning enemy expectations against them. That showed up again in Korea, in Vietnam, in every conflict where a weaker force had to leverage ingenuity against superior firepower. And on the other side, the American response to the Panzer established a pattern. Rapid intelligence sharing, tactical bulletins, decentralized decision-making that allowed junior leaders to identify and counter threats without waiting for higher headquarters to catch up. That became doctrine, got refined and improved, turned into the combined arms warfare that defined American military operations for the next 60 years. All of it traced back in some small way to moments like the one Kowalski experienced. Junior leaders making hard calls, trusting their judgment, accepting the consequences. The American military machine was built on the assumption that sergeants and lieutenants could think, could adapt, could solve problems that the field manual didn't cover. Sometimes they got it wrong. Sometimes they got people hurt. But often enough, they got it right. And that made all the difference. The wreck itself was probably scrapped after the war, cut up and melted down, turned into rebar or refrigerators or some other peacetime product. No marker, no memorial, nothing to indicate that this particular piece of ground had been the site of a small tactical victory that prevented a larger tactical disaster. The earth healed, the snow melted, the forest grew back, Belgium moved on, but the men who were there never really moved on. They carried it, the way veterans carry all of it, the noise and the fear and the impossible decisions. The weight of command, even when that command was just a platoon of tanks in a frozen forest. The knowledge that your choices mattered, that people lived or died based on whether you read a situation correctly. Kowalski understood that weight. He'd carried it for 60 years, from Belgium to the grave. He'd made peace with it, found ways to integrate it into a normal life, learned to function despite the memories. But he never pretended it wasn't there, never claimed that the war was over just because the shooting stopped. The last thing he said about the wreck, recorded in an oral history interview conducted 3 months before he died, was characteristically simple. I didn't do anything special. I just paid attention and acted on what I saw. Any good sergeant would have done the same. But that wasn't quite true, and Kowalski probably knew it. Plenty of good sergeants would have followed orders, bypassed the wreck, pushed to the objective like they were told. They would have been following doctrine, following the chain of command, doing exactly what they were supposed to do. And men would have died because of it. Somewhere down the line, when that hidden gun finally revealed itself, Kowalski did something different. He questioned, he analyzed, he made a battlefield decision that contradicted his orders because his tactical assessment told him the orders were wrong. That took judgment. It also took courage, the kind of courage that has nothing to do with charging machine guns and everything to do with accepting responsibility for unconventional choices. The military needs both kinds of courage, the kind that drives men forward into fire, and the kind that allows leaders to deviate from the plan when the plan doesn't match reality. Kowalski had both. That's what made him effective. That's what kept his people alive. The 3rd Armored Division was deactivated in 1992, its colors cased, its history preserved in museums and archives. The men who'd served in its ranks scattered across the country, growing old, telling stories, passing on whatever wisdom they'd gained from their time in the furnace. Brennan outlived Kowalski by 3 years, made it to 86 before cancer finished what German guns couldn't. At Brennan's funeral, someone asked him if he'd been scared during the assault on the wreck. The old gunner smiled, that same grin from the photograph in Belgium, and gave the honest answer. Every single second. But Kowalski was scared too, and he didn't let it stop him. So neither did I. That might be the best epitaph for the entire generation. They were scared, they were cold, they were far from home, and facing an enemy that was just as determined, just as skilled, just as willing to die for their cause. But they didn't let the fear stop them. They did the job, made the hard calls, trusted each other when trust was the only thing holding the line. The wreck in the snow was just one small piece of that larger story. One decision, one engagement, one tiny moment in a war that killed 60 million people and reshaped the entire world. By any objective measure, it was insignificant. A footnote. A minor tactical action that wouldn't even rate a mention in most histories of the Battle of the Bulge. But to the men who were there, it was everything. It was the moment when training and instinct aligned, when the risk paid off, when the impossible decision turned out to be the right one. It was proof that they could trust themselves, that their judgment mattered, that they were capable of more than just following orders. And to the men who came after, who read the tactical bulletins and learned to recognize the signs, it was the difference between living and dying. Information purchased with courage, shared freely, used to save lives. That was the real victory. Not the destroyed gun position, not the enemy casualties, not the successful assault. The real victory was the knowledge gained and the lives saved because of it. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The modern army still teaches case studies from World War II, and occasionally the Panzer nest tactic comes up in classes on adaptive enemy tactics. The instructors use it as an example of creative problem-solving under resource constraints, of how a determined enemy can leverage limited assets for maximum effect. They usually don't mention Kowalski by name. The records from that engagement list 2nd Platoon, 3rd Armored Division, no individual attribution. That would have suited Kowalski fine. He never wanted recognition, never sought the spotlight. He wanted his people to go home alive, wanted to do his job competently, wanted to make it through the war with his humanity intact. He accomplished all three, which made him luckier than most. The generation that fought World War II is nearly gone now. The youngest veterans are approaching 100 years old, the ranks thinning every day. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers the snow in Belgium, the sound of a tank engine in the cold, the specific fear that came with facing an enemy who was smart enough to turn your losses into weapons. But the lessons remain. Pay attention to details. Trust your instincts when they conflict with doctrine. Question orders that don't match the tactical reality. Accept responsibility for unconventional decisions. Share knowledge freely. Learn from every engagement. Adapt faster than the enemy. Those principles outlive the men who practice them. They get passed down, refined, incorporated into training, tested in new conflicts against new enemies. The specifics change. The weapons evolve. The battlefield shifts from European forests to Asian jungles to Middle Eastern deserts. But the underlying truth stays constant. War demands thinking soldiers, not automatons. It rewards initiative, punishes rigidity, and respects competence above all else. Kowalski understood that. He lived it, taught it, embodied it, and when his time came, he left behind a legacy that had nothing to do with medals or commendations and everything to do with the example he set. A sergeant who cared more about his people than his career, who made hard calls and accepted the consequences, who understood that leadership wasn't about authority, it was about responsibility. The wreck in the snow became a symbol of all of that, not because the engagement was particularly significant in the grand scheme of the war, but because it represented a larger truth about what made the Allied victory possible. Millions of individual decisions, made by junior leaders at every level, that collectively outweighed German tactical superiority and operational excellence. The Germans had better tanks, better tactics, better training in many respects. What they didn't have was an organizational culture that empowered sergeants to question orders, to deviate from doctrine, to make battlefield decisions based on their assessment of the situation. The Wehrmacht was a top-down structure that expected obedience, that punished initiative, that valued conformity over creativity. The American Army, for all its flaws and inefficiencies, did the opposite. It pushed decision-making down to the lowest practical level, expected junior leaders to think, rewarded initiative even when it resulted in mistakes. That cultural difference was decisive. It allowed the Americans to adapt faster, to learn from every engagement, to share knowledge across units in ways that the German command structure couldn't match. Kowalski was a product of that culture, and his decision to assault the wreck was a perfect example of it in action. He saw something that didn't make sense, analyzed it, concluded that his orders were based on incomplete information, and acted on his own tactical judgment. In another army, that would have been insubordination. In the American Army, it was exactly what sergeants were expected to do. The price of that empowerment was high. Mistakes got made. Men died because of bad calls, poor judgment, arrogance disguised as initiative. The system wasn't perfect, and it asked a lot of young leaders who were barely old enough to vote, let alone make life and death decisions under fire. But it worked. Not every time, not without cost, but often enough to win. And the men who made it work, who carried that responsibility and delivered under impossible circumstances, deserve to be remembered. Not as heroes, not as larger-than-life figures, but as what they actually were. Ordinary men who did extraordinary things because the situation demanded it, and they refused to let their people down. That was Kowalski. That was Brennan. That was every sergeant and corporal and private who looked at an impossible situation and found a way through it. They weren't supermen. They were scared kids from farms and factories, thrust into mechanized warfare against a skilled enemy, doing their best with inadequate equipment and incomplete information. And somehow, they won. They made the right calls often enough, trusted each other completely enough, adapted quickly enough to overcome every disadvantage. The wreck in the snow was just one tiny piece of that victory, one small decision in a cascade of millions. But it mattered. Every decision mattered. Every life saved mattered. Every lesson learned and shared mattered. The men who fought that war understood something that's easy to forget in peacetime. There are moments when everything hinges on individual judgment, when doctrine and planning and preparation all fall away, and what remains is a human being making a choice. Those moments reveal character. They show what people are made of when the consequences are absolute, and the margin for error is zero. Kowalski's moment came in the snow, looking at a wreck that made no tactical sense, choosing to trust his instincts over his orders. He got it right. The gun was there. The threat was real. The decision saved lives. But the outcome was never guaranteed. He could have been wrong. The wreck could have been exactly what it appeared to be, just another piece of battlefield debris. His crew could have died assaulting a position that didn't matter. That's the burden of command. You make the call with incomplete information, you accept the risk, you live with the results. Sometimes you're right, Sometimes you're wrong, but you never really know until the smoke clears and the butcher's bill comes due. Kowalski made his peace with that burden. He carried it honorably, passed on what he learned, and left the world better than he found it. Not through grand gestures or historic achievements, but through thousands of small decisions made correctly, lessons shared freely, and people brought home alive who might otherwise have stayed in foreign soil. That's the real story of the wreck. Not the tactics, not the drama, not the narrow escape. The real story is about a man who understood his responsibilities, trusted his judgment, and did what he thought was right even when it contradicted his orders. The real story is about courage defined not as fearlessness, but as action despite fear. The real story is about leadership measured not in rank or authority, but in the willingness to accept responsibility for hard choices. Those are the stories worth remembering, worth telling, worth preserving. Not because they make war seem glorious or heroic, but because they remind us what people are capable of when everything depends on getting it right. The capacity for judgment under pressure, for creative problem-solving in impossible situations, for trust and teamwork and sacrifice. The men of World War II possessed those qualities in abundance. They proved it in 1,000 engagements across every theater of the war. They earned the world they helped create, the peace they fought for, the freedom they defended. And they did it without asking for anything in return except the chance to come home and live normal lives. Kowalski got that chance. He used it well, built a family, contributed to his community, passed on his wisdom to anyone who asked. He never forgot what he'd seen, never stopped carrying the weight, but he never let it define him either. He was a veteran, but he was also a husband, a father, a grandfather, a citizen. All of those roles mattered. All of them were part of who he was. The wreck in the snow was just one chapter in a long life. Important, yes. Formative, certainly. But not the whole story. Kowalski was more than one decision in one battle. He was a complete human being who happened to serve at a crucial moment in history and rose to the occasion when it mattered most. That's worth remembering. That's worth honoring. Not the mythology, not the simplified narrative, but the complex reality of a man who did his best in an impossible situation and somehow got it right when it counted. The snow in Belgium melted 79 years ago. The wreck was scrapped. The battlefield returned to farmland. The men who fought there scattered to the winds of time. But the lesson endures, passed down through generations of soldiers who learned that war rewards initiative, that doctrine is a guide, not a mandate, that junior leaders who think and adapt and trust their judgment are worth their weight in gold. Kowalski taught that lesson through his actions. He lived it, embodied it, proved it in the crucible of combat. And in doing so, he became part of something larger than himself, part of the tradition of American military leadership that values competence over conformity, results over process, and people above all else. That tradition continues. It adapts. It evolves. It faces new challenges in new conflicts. But the core remains the same. Trust your people. Empower them to make decisions. Hold them accountable for results. Learn from every engagement. Share knowledge freely. Never stop adapting. Those principles won World War II. They'll win whatever comes next. And they all trace back in some small way to moments like the one Kowalski experienced in the snow, when a sergeant looked at a wreck and saw a threat, when instinct overruled doctrine, when one good decision rippled outward and saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. That's the power of leadership done right. That's the legacy of the men who fought that war. That's what we owe them. Not empty praise or shallow patriotism, but genuine understanding of what they accomplished and why it still matters today. The wreck in the snow. A welding trick that terrified Panzer commanders once the secret was out. A hidden gun that never got the chance to spring its ambush. A sergeant who trusted his gut and got it right. Lives saved, lessons learned, knowledge shared. In the end, that's all any soldier can hope for. To do the job well, to bring people home, to leave things better than they found them. Kowalski did all three. He made his mark, he earned his rest. And the world he helped preserve will remember him, not as a hero on a pedestal, but as what he actually was. A good sergeant who made the right call when it mattered most. The records from 2nd Platoon's engagement with the Panzer nest were filed at division headquarters on January 17, 1945. Standard after-action report, typed on a manual typewriter by a clerk who'd probably never seen combat, reduced to military bureaucracy and filing codes. Enemy position neutralized, no friendly casualties, tactical intelligence gathered, recommended for distribution to subordinate units. But buried in that dry language was something the clerk couldn't capture. The report mentioned that Kowalski had deviated from his assigned route, had engaged a target he'd been ordered to bypass, had made a tactical decision that contradicted direct instructions from battalion. In another unit, under another command structure, that deviation could have resulted in disciplinary action. The fact that he'd been right didn't automatically excuse the insubordination. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, read the report 3 times before making his decision. Webb was regular Army, West Point class of 38, a man who believed in discipline and chain of command. He'd seen enough maverick officers and non-coms get people killed with unauthorized actions that he had every reason to come down hard on Kowalski. The manual was clear: you follow orders, you don't freelance. You don't ignore directives from higher headquarters just because you have a hunch. But Webb was also smart enough to recognize the difference between recklessness and tactical judgment. He'd read the intelligence reports coming out of other sectors, the accounts of American units being ambushed by concealed positions they'd assumed were harmless. He understood that Kowalski's deviation had potentially saved not just his own platoon, but every unit that would receive the updated tactical bulletin. Webb filed a letter of commendation instead of charges. He also used the incident in a training briefing for all company commanders in the battalion, making it clear that initiative and judgment were valued when they produced results. But he also emphasized the razor's edge that separated good tactical decisions from catastrophic mistakes. Kowalski had walked that edge and survived. The next sergeant might not be so lucky. The briefing created ripples of its own. Company commanders took the lesson back to their platoons, started encouraging their junior leaders to think critically about the battlefield, to question assumptions, to trust their training and instincts. It wasn't a revolutionary change in doctrine, but it was a subtle shift in culture. The American Army was learning, adapting, becoming more effective with every engagement. The Germans were learning too, but their lessons went in the opposite direction. As the Reich collapsed, as resources dwindled and manpower evaporated, German tactical doctrine became increasingly rigid. There was no room for the kind of decentralized decision-making that characterized American operations. Orders came from higher headquarters, and those orders were absolute. Deviation meant court-martial or worse. That rigidity showed up in unexpected ways. When American forces started actively hunting for Panzer nests, the Germans couldn't adapt quickly enough. They'd invested time and resources into creating these positions, and abandoning the tactic meant admitting the effort had been wasted. So they kept trying, kept digging in guns under wrecked vehicles, kept hoping that American crews would be careless or inattentive. It didn't work. By February of 1945, the tactic was effectively dead. American tankers approached every wreck with caution, used infantry to clear suspicious positions, called in artillery on anything that looked modified or defended. The Germans lost the guns they'd hidden, lost the crews manning those positions, lost whatever tactical advantage the surprise might have provided. Kowalski watched this evolution from his position with 2nd Platoon. He saw the tactical bulletins getting distributed, saw the way American units changed their approach to battlefield debris, saw the enemy attempts to spring ambushes fail because the surprise was gone. It validated his decision, proved that the risk had been worth taking, but it didn't make him feel particularly heroic. It just made him feel tired. The winter campaign in Europe was brutal in ways that went beyond enemy action. The cold was a constant presence, sapping energy, making every task harder than it needed to be. Equipment froze, ammunition jammed, men suffered from frostbite and trench foot and pneumonia. The Germans were fighting with the desperation of a cornered animal, making every yard of ground expensive, contesting every village and crossroads with a ferocity that suggested they knew the end was coming and wanted to make it cost as much as possible. 2nd Platoon lost its first tank in late January, not to enemy action, but to mechanical failure. The transmission seized in temperatures that dropped below zero, and despite the crew's best efforts, the tank was immobilized. They stripped it of useful parts, set demolition charges, and left it burning in a field somewhere in eastern Belgium. One less Sherman, one less crew at full strength. The war ground on. Brennan asked Kowalski one night if he ever regretted the decision to assault the wreck. They were sitting in a commandeered barn, trying to stay warm near an improvised stove made from an oil drum. The question caught Kowalski off guard. He'd been thinking about everything except that engagement, focused on keeping his remaining tanks operational and his crews alive through the next day's movement. Do I regret it? No. Would I do it again? Probably. Do I think it was the right call? Yes. But the answer to all those questions would be different if we'd taken casualties or if that gun hadn't been there. That's the thing about combat decisions. They're only right in retrospect. In the moment, you're just guessing. Brennan nodded slowly, accepting the answer. The two men sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind howl outside and the metal of the stove tick as it expanded from the heat. Finally, Brennan spoke again, his voice quiet. I'm glad you trusted your gut, Ski. I'm glad we went in. Even if it had been wrong, even if there'd been nothing there, I'd still be glad we checked. Better to assault an empty position than to bypass a live one and let it kill someone else. That perspective stuck with Kowalski. The idea that some risks were worth taking, not because success was guaranteed, but because failure was unacceptable. You couldn't save everyone, you couldn't prevent every ambush or neutralize every threat, but you could refuse to walk past something that your instincts told you was dangerous. You could choose engagement over avoidance, even when engagement meant exposing yourself and your people to fire. The philosophy carried him through the rest of the winter and into the spring offensive. 2nd Platoon kept moving east, kept fighting, kept taking casualties and receiving replacements. The faces changed, the names changed, but the mission stayed the same. Close with and destroy the enemy. Advance. Hold ground. Repeat until the war ended, or you became a casualty yourself. They crossed the Rhine on March 24th, part of the massive Allied push into Germany's industrial heartland. The river crossing was an engineering marvel. Pontoon bridges thrown across the water under enemy fire. Tanks and trucks and infantry streaming east into territory that had never seen foreign occupation. The Germans fought back with everything they had left, which wasn't much. By this point, the Luftwaffe was a ghost. Fuel shortages had paralyzed most armor units, and the infantry was a mix of old men and teenagers who'd been handed rifles and told to stop the Allied advance. It was a slaughter, but it was a necessary slaughter. Every day the war continued. People died in camps, civilians starved in besieged cities, and desperate German commanders threw away lives in pointless defensive actions. The only way to end it was to advance, to crush the remaining resistance, to make continuation of hostilities impossible. Kowalski understood the calculus, but that didn't make it easier to watch. He'd been fighting Germans for 9 months now, and he'd developed a grudging respect for their tactical competence and their determination. But he'd also seen what they were capable of when they had power, and that eliminated any sympathy he might have felt. These were the people who'd built the camps, who'd systematized murder, who'd started a war that killed millions. Whatever happened to them now, they'd earned it. 2nd Platoon reached the Elbe River in mid-April, one of thousands of American units that had driven across Germany in less than a month. The Soviet forces were pushing from the east, the British and Canadians from the north, the Americans from the west. Germany was being squeezed out of existence, crushed between forces that outnumbered and outgunned them in every category that mattered. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The end came in early May, announced over the radio in multiple languages, confirmed by officers who could barely believe the war was actually over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hitler was dead, the Reich was finished, the fighting in Europe was done. Men who'd been preparing for another day of combat suddenly had to process the idea that they might actually survive, that the odds they'd been playing against for months or years had finally shifted in their favor. Kowalski's first reaction was numbness. He'd been running on adrenaline and discipline for so long that peace felt unreal, like a trick or a mistake. He kept expecting the orders to resume the advance, kept scanning the horizon for enemy movement, kept his crew on alert because relaxing got people killed. It took 3 days for the reality to sink in. The war was over. He'd made it. Against all odds and probability, he was going home. But going home turned out to be complicated. The army needed experienced personnel to handle occupation duties, to process prisoners, to maintain order in a country that had collapsed into chaos. Kowalski's platoon got assigned to security details in Czechoslovakia, guarding supply depots and monitoring displaced persons camps. It was boring work compared to combat, but it was necessary work, and it gave him time to process everything he'd experienced. The camps were the hardest part, not the DP camps where refugees waited for repatriation, but the other camps, the ones the Germans had built for systematic extermination. Kowalski's unit didn't liberate any of the major death camps. Those had been overrun weeks earlier by other forces, but they encountered smaller facilities, labor camps and transit camps where the evidence of atrocity was impossible to ignore. He thought he understood what the war was about: freedom versus tyranny, democracy versus fascism, the Allies fighting to stop German and Japanese aggression. But standing in a camp where thousands had been worked to death, or simply murdered, where the crematoria still smelled of burnt flesh, and the barracks were filled with evidence of systematic dehumanization, Kowalski realized the war had been about something even more fundamental. It had been about preventing the total victory of evil, about stopping a regime that had industrialized murder and packaged genocide as state policy. That realization changed how he thought about his service. Every day he'd kept his crew alive. Every German position he'd helped neutralize. Every mile of ground they'd taken had contributed to ending the camps. Not directly, not immediately, but as part of the larger effort that had crushed the Reich and stopped the killing. The wreck in Belgium, the Panzer nest, the hidden gun, all of it had been tiny pieces of a puzzle that added up to liberation. Brennan saw it the same way. The two men walked through one of the camps together, not speaking, just bearing witness. Afterward, sitting in their tank with the hatches open and the spring sun warming the metal, Brennan said what they were both thinking. Everything we did, every risk we took, every fire mission we called in, it was worth it. Even if we'd known it would be this bad, it would still have been worth it. Kowalski agreed. The moral weight of the war had been abstract before, a matter of newsreels and propaganda. Now, it was concrete, undeniable, impossible to rationalize away. The Allied cause had been just, the victory necessary, the sacrifice meaningful. Men had died to stop this. His friends had died to stop this. And their deaths had accomplished something real and important. That knowledge didn't make the losses easier to bear, but it gave them context. It meant that the sergeants and privates and lieutenants who'd been killed in France or Belgium or Germany hadn't died for nothing. They'd died to end something that needed ending, to prevent something that couldn't be allowed to continue. In the grand calculus of history, their lives had purchased something valuable: freedom for millions, justice for the murdered, and the prevention of future atrocities on a similar scale. Kowalski carried that understanding for the rest of his life. When people asked him about the war, when they wanted to know if it had been worth the cost, he'd think about the camps. He'd remember the evidence of what the Allies had been fighting against, and the answer was always the same. Yes, it was worth it. Every life lost, every injury suffered, every trauma inflicted, all of it was worth it to stop what they'd been doing. The rotation home finally came in July of '45. 2nd Platoon was deactivated, its personnel scattered to different units, or sent back to the States based on a point system that factored in time in service, time in combat, and family status. Kowalski had enough points to justify immediate repatriation. Brennan did too. They said goodbye to the men who'd served with them, most of whom they'd only known for a few weeks or months, and boarded trucks that took them to a processing center in France. The journey back to America was surreal. The Liberty ship was crowded with men who couldn't quite believe they'd survived, who spent the voyage alternating between celebration and quiet reflection. Some drank, some gambled, some wrote letters they'd been too superstitious to write during combat. Kowalski mostly stayed on deck, watching the ocean and trying to figure out how to transition from being a tank commander to being a civilian. The problem was that he'd been good at his job. Really good. He'd kept his crew alive through 9 months of combat, had made tactical decisions that saved lives and accomplished missions, had earned the respect of his superiors and subordinates. In the Army, he had purpose, responsibility, authority. He knew what was expected of him, and he delivered. But civilian life didn't offer anything comparable. There were no clear objectives, no chain of command, no mission to accomplish. He talked to Brennan about it one night, standing at the rail while the ship cut through the Atlantic swells. The gunner understood immediately. "It's going to be hard," he said. "Nobody back home will understand what we did or why it mattered. They'll thank us for our service, and then expect us to go back to being who we were before. But we can't. That person doesn't exist anymore." Kowalski knew Brennan was right, but he didn't have a solution. You couldn't explain combat to someone who hadn't experienced it. You couldn't make them understand the bond between crew members who'd trusted each other with their lives every single day. You couldn't convey the weight of making decisions where the wrong choice meant people died. The gap between veteran and civilian was too wide to bridge with words. So most veterans didn't try. They came home, they found work, they started families, and they kept the war locked away in a part of their mind that civilians couldn't access. It was the only way to function, the only way to build a normal life, but it came at a cost. The isolation, the sense of being fundamentally different from everyone around you, the knowledge that you'd seen and done things that most people couldn't imagine. The ship docked in New York on July 23, 1945. The city was celebrating, ticker tape parades for returning heroes, crowds cheering, bands playing. Kowalski walked through it all feeling like a spectator at someone else's party. The celebration was for a sanitized version of victory, for newsreel footage and inspiring speeches. It wasn't for the reality he'd experienced. The mud and blood and burning tanks, the friends who didn't come home, the moral complexity of killing men who were probably just following orders, just like he was. He made it back to Cleveland 3 days later, took a bus from the train station to his family's neighborhood, walked up the steps of the house he'd left 2 years earlier. His mother opened the door, saw him standing there in his uniform, and started crying. His father shook his hand, gripped his shoulder, didn't say much because there wasn't much to say. His younger brother asked if he'd killed any Nazis, and Kowalski said yes without elaborating. The next few weeks were strange. People wanted to hear war stories, but they wanted the exciting parts, the victories and the close calls. They didn't want to hear about the cold or the fear or the randomness of who lived and who died. They definitely didn't want to hear about the camps. So Kowalski learned to edit, to give them the version of events that satisfied their curiosity without burdening them with the parts they couldn't process. The wreck became one of his standard stories. He described the suspicious defensive positions, the decision to assault, the hidden gun, the successful neutralization of the threat. People liked that story because it had a clear beginning, middle, and end. Hero identifies problem, hero takes action, problem gets solved. It fit the narrative they wanted to believe about the war. What Kowalski didn't tell them was how close it had come to disaster. How 1 degree different in the angle of approach would have put his tank in the kill zone. How the German mortar team had almost bracketed them before they reached the wreck. How the secondary explosions from the stored ammunition could have killed his crew if they'd been a few yards closer. The victory had been real, but it had also been lucky, and luck wasn't something you could count on. He found work at a manufacturing plant, married a girl he'd known in high school, started building the life that returning veterans were supposed to build. House in the suburbs, steady job, children, participation in community organizations. From the outside, it looked like successful reintegration. From the inside, it felt like playing a role, like pretending to be someone he wasn't anymore. The nightmares started 6 months after he got home. Combat dreams, always the same basic scenario. His tank immobilized, enemy closing in, crew looking to him for orders that wouldn't come. He'd wake up sweating, heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that he'd failed somehow. His wife learned not to wake him during these episodes, learned to wait until he came out of it on his own. The Veterans Administration offered counseling, but Kowalski never went. The stigma around mental health issues was too strong, and admitting that you were struggling felt like admitting weakness. So he dealt with it the way most veterans dealt with it, through silence and suppression and the hope that time would make it better. Time helped, but it didn't cure. The dreams became less frequent, but never disappeared entirely. Certain sounds, a backfire from a truck, thunder during a storm, fireworks on the 4th of July, would trigger reactions that he couldn't control. His body would tense, his mind would shift into combat mode, and for a few seconds he'd be back in Belgium, scanning for threats, ready to give orders to a crew that wasn't there. His children grew up knowing that Dad had fought in the war, but not knowing any details beyond the sanitized stories he'd tell when pressed. They knew he'd been a tank commander, knew he'd been in Europe, knew he'd earned some medals that he kept in a drawer and never displayed. They didn't know about the Panzer nest, didn't know about the camps, didn't know about the weight he carried every single day. Kowalski was okay with that arrangement. His war had been his war, his burden to carry, his experiences to process. He didn't want to pass that weight to the next generation. They deserved to grow up without the shadows of Normandy and the Bulge and the Elbe hanging over them. They deserved peace, real peace, the kind that his generation had fought for, but could never fully experience themselves. The reunion culture among veterans helped. Kowalski started attending 3rd Armored Division gatherings in the late 50s, reconnecting with men who'd shared the experience, who understood without explanation. At these reunions, he could talk about the war honestly, could discuss the fear and the losses and the moral ambiguity without worrying about burdening civilians with information they couldn't process. Brennan was a regular at these events, still sharp, still carrying himself like the gunner who'd served through the entire European campaign. The two men would find a quiet corner, drink beer, and talk about the things they couldn't discuss with anyone else. The friends who hadn't made it home, the decisions that still haunted them, the way civilian life felt simultaneously normal and completely alien. At the reunion in '62, Kowalski learned that the Army had used the Panzer nest engagement as a training case study. A captain from the armor school at Fort Knox had researched the action, interviewed survivors, compiled a tactical analysis that was now part of the curriculum for junior officers. The wreck in Belgium had become an example of effective decentralized decision-making, of the importance of tactical awareness, of trusting subordinate leaders to make battlefield judgments. Kowalski didn't know how to feel about that. Pride that his decision had been validated, certainly, but also a kind of discomfort with the sanitization, with the reduction of a terrifying moment into a bullet point in a training manual. The analysis captured the tactical details, but missed the human dimension, the fear and uncertainty, and the knowledge that one wrong call would mean dead crewmen and a destroyed tank. Still, he understood why the Army did it. Institutions learn by studying past actions, by identifying what worked and what didn't, by turning individual experiences into collective knowledge. If future tank commanders learn to trust their instincts from studying his engagement, if that lesson saved lives in future conflicts, then the sanitization was worth it. The decades rolled past. Kowalski retired from the manufacturing plant in '83, started spending more time at the VFW post, volunteered with local veterans organizations. His children had children, and those grandchildren would occasionally ask about the war, about what Grandpa had done during the big one. He'd tell them the same edited stories he'd told their parents, focusing on the parts that conveyed courage and competence without dwelling on the horror. But to one grandson, the one who kept asking questions and seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than just collecting anecdotes, Kowalski told a fuller version. He described the cold, the fear, the randomness of survival. He talked about the Panzer nest, but he also talked about the friends who died, about the moral weight of command, about the difficulty of transitioning back to civilian life. The grandson asked the question that civilians always asked: was it worth it? Did the sacrifice accomplish something meaningful? Kowalski's answer was the same one he'd been giving for 40 years. Yes, absolutely yes, because the alternative was letting evil win, letting the camps continue, letting tyranny spread. We paid a price for victory, but the price of defeat would have been infinitely higher. That answer satisfied the grandson, and it satisfied Kowalski. Because it was true. The war had been worth fighting, the victory worth achieving, the sacrifice meaningful. Not in some abstract patriotic sense, but in concrete terms. Millions of people were alive because the Allies won. Millions of people were free because soldiers like Kowalski had done their jobs. The world was better because ordinary men had risen to extraordinary circumstances and delivered when it mattered most. The wreck in the snow, the welding trick, the hidden gun, all of it had been one tiny piece of that larger victory. One sergeant making one good decision that rippled outward in ways he couldn't predict or measure. That was how wars were won, not through grand strategy alone, but through thousands of small tactical victories achieved by junior leaders who refused to take the easy path when the hard path was the right one. Kowalski died in 2004, surrounded by family, at peace with his life and his service. He'd carried the weight of command for 60 years, had processed the trauma, had found ways to honor the fallen while building a meaningful life. He'd been a good soldier, a good sergeant, a good man. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything that mattered.